The men of Redemption Gulch had a special kind of cruelty, save for women they couldn't own. And my name is Serafina Hayes. My secret was a barren womb, an emptiness that echoed louder than the drunken shouts in Bartholomew's saloon. In a town where a woman's worth was measured by the sons she could put to work, I was worthless. A dry well, a fallow field. So when my husband's debts grew higher than the mountains that circled our miserable town, they cooked up a punishment that was also a joke. A real knee slapper for the boys at the bar. They sent me, the infertile bride, deep into the wastelands. A peace offering. That's what they called it. A gift for a wounded Apache warrior they wanted gone. They expected the wilderness to swallow me whole. They expected the buzzards to pick my bones clean. They never ever imagined I'd come back. And they sure as hell never imagined I'd be carrying a child. The dust in Redemption Gulch was a fine red powder. It settled on everything. A constant, gritty reminder of the parched land we'd clawed our existence from. It got in your food, in your water, deep in your soul. For 3 years, that dust had been my only companion. That, in the silence in our small, warped cabin. I was the wife of Samuel Hayes, and in the eyes of every man, woman, and child in that town, I was a failure. Samuel was a man made of hopeful sunrises and disastrous sunsets. He'd come west dreaming of silver, but his hands were better at holding a whiskey glass than a pickaxe. His charm, the thing that had once felt like warm sunshine on my face, had long since soured into a desperate, pleading whine. His debts were a chain around both our necks, a chain held by one man, Bartholomew Kane. Kane was the town's unofficial king. He owned the saloon, the mercantile, and the mortgage on damn near every soul in that gulch. His smile was a flash of gold tooth and pure malice. His eyes had a way of stripping you bare, counting your flaws like they were coins in his pocket. And my flaw was singular, public. In a place that valued sons, my womb was silent. The word followed me like a shadow. Barren. They spat it like tobacco juice. The other wives, their aprons stretched tight over full bellies, would offer me pity that felt more like poison. Their eyes held a mix of contempt and a grim satisfaction in their own fertility. They'd talk of tonics and prayers, but it was all just a show, a way to make themselves feel righteous while they looked down on me. Samuel, to his credit, never blamed me out loud, but I saw it. I saw it in the slump of his shoulders when another man's son ran by. I saw it in the way his eyes would slide away from mine in the quiet of our bed. The silence in our cabin was a living thing, a third person in our marriage. It was the silence of a cradle never rocked, of lullabies never sung. And it was that silence that led to the joke. It started where all cruelties in Redemption Gulch started, in Kane's saloon. The air was thick with stale beer, sweat, and the stench of desperation. Samuel had been summoned. I waited in the cabin, darning one of his worn shirts, the needle moving in a steady rhythm. Stab and pull, stab and pull. It did nothing to soothe the frantic bird beating against my ribs. He came back long after dark. He stumbled through the door, reeking of cheap whiskey and raw fear. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "What is it, Samuel?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He collapsed into a chair, burying his head in his hands. "Kane. He made an offer." Bartholomew Kane did not make offers. He issued decrees. He held the paper that represented our ruin, and he was tired of waiting. "He'll wipe the slate clean," Samuel mumbled into his palms. "All of it. The debt on the claim, the tab at the store, everything." A cold dread coiled in my gut. Kane's generosity was a rattlesnake, beautiful in its promise, deadly in its strike. "For what price?" Samuel finally looked up. His face was a twisted mask of shame and sickening relief. "There's a native, been seen up in the Crimson Canyons, wounded. The ranchers say he's been scaring the cattle." I waited, my blood turning to ice. I knew these men. They saw the native people as obstacles, specters from a world they were determined to conquer and erase. "The men want to go up there and finish him." Samuel's voice cracked. "But Kane says that's messy. Bad for business if the army gets wind of it. He says a gesture of peace is better." He paused, the words catching in his throat. "What gesture?" I pressed, but I already knew. The shape of the joke was forming in the shadows of our cabin. They want to send a woman, he choked out. A peace offering, to show goodwill. A bride, he called it. He finally looked right at me, his eyes swimming with an unbearable mix of apology and pure cowardice. He wants to send you, Serafina. The air rushed out of my lungs. It wasn't a peace offering. It was a death sentence, gift wrapped in mockery. Send the barren woman, the useless wife, send her to a savage they believed was on death's door. If the warrior killed me, well, then they had their excuse to ride up and slaughter him. A righteous cause. If I died of thirst or starvation, it was one less mouth to feed and a debt erased. Tidy. And if, by some impossible, cruel twist of fate, the warrior accepted this bride, it was the greatest joke of all. The infertile woman given to a dying remnant of a dying race. The punchline was my life. You agreed, I said. It wasn't a question. Sarah, what choice did I have? He pleaded, his voice rising in desperation. He would have ruined us, taken everything. This way, we have a chance. We? The word was acid on my tongue. There is no we in this, Samuel. You have a chance to be free of your debts and your barren wife in one neat little transaction. Tears streamed down his face. Pathetic. Useless. They'll give you a horse, he whispered. Water. Some food. They say he's in Painted Rock Gorge. You go. That's all. That was all. I was to be traded like a mule. My life, the currency for my husband's failures, the scorn of the town, which had been 1,000 stinging nettles, now came together in a single, brutal blow. I looked at the man I had married, the man who had promised to protect me, and I saw a stranger, a weak, frightened boy who would feed me to the wolves to save his own skin. In that moment, something inside me broke. But beneath the break, something else began to form. Something harder, colder, a sliver of ice in the desolate landscape of my heart. I would not give them the satisfaction of my tears. I would not let them see me crumble. Fine, I said, my voice eerily calm. Tell Mr. Kane his offer is accepted. Samuel stared, his jaw slack with surprise and a dawning, horrified respect. He had expected hysterics. He had not expected this chilling surrender. The next morning, the whole town gathered to watch. It was a spectacle. Bartholomew Kane stood on the porch of his saloon, a smug grin plastered on his face. He made a grand speech about forging peace, about our community's compassion. The words were a vile mockery, and everyone there knew it. The men smirked into their hands. The women watched with a morbid curiosity, their faces a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them. They gave me a swayback mare, a single water skin, and a sack with a loaf of stale bread and a strip of dried beef, just enough to make their pretense of charity seem plausible. As I mounted the horse, my movements stiff and deliberate, Kane stepped forward. You bring him peace, Mrs. Hayes, he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Show him the gentle heart of civilization. I looked down at him, my gaze level and cold, and for the first time I think he saw past the barren wife. I think he glimpsed the woman I was becoming. He saw someone with nothing left to lose, and that, I realized, was a terrifying kind of freedom. I did not look at Samuel. I couldn't bear to see his face. I simply turned the mare's head west, toward the jagged teeth of the Crimson Canyons, and rode out of Redemption Gulch without a single backward glance. The silence of the wilderness ahead was less daunting than the silence I was leaving behind. They had sent me into the wild to die, the punchline to their cruel joke. But a story doesn't always end the way its authors intend. The sun was a merciless hammer in a brassy sky. Within an hour, Redemption Gulch was just a smudge on the horizon, easily wiped away by the shimmering heat. The world became a vast, silent expanse of rock and sand, broken only by the skeletal arms of cacti and the occasional stubborn juniper. The only sounds were the plod of the mare's hooves, the creak of old leather, and the frantic, dry rasp of my own breathing. They had pointed me toward Painted Rock Gorge, a place whispered about in town as being haunted. Bad medicine. No one from Redemption Gulch ever went there willingly. It was the perfect place to discard someone you wanted to forget. By midday, the water in the skin was warm and tasted of animal hide. The bread was a hard brick in my stomach. The mare, who I decided to call Bess, was a creature of profound exhaustion. Her head hung low, her gait a shuffling misery. We were two unwanted females cast out into an indifferent wilderness. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in my belly that the sun could not warm. Every skitter of a lizard, every shadow of a circling hawk sent a jolt of terror through me. I was a town woman, used to walls and doors. Out here, there was no protection. I was prey. I thought of snakes coiled in the shade of rocks, of mountain lions with eyes like yellow lamps. And I thought of the man I was being sent to find. The townspeople called him a beast, a red devil, a phantom of violence. In my mind, he was a monster with a bloodied knife and eyes full of hate. I was being delivered to him, a lamb to the slaughter. By the second day, a profound loneliness set in. It was more than just being alone. It was the absence of meaning. My life, once defined by my relationship to others, daughter, wife, barren woman, was now defined by nothing but the struggle to draw the next breath. The sun stripped away all pretense. Thirst, hunger, and exhaustion became my entire reality. The shame of Redemption Gulch felt like a memory from another life. On the evening of the third day, I found it. The gorge. It was a deep wound in the earth, a slash of shadow and color. The setting sun painted the canyon walls in hues of ochre, crimson, and deep violet. It was terrifyingly beautiful. A thin trickle of water, barely a damp stain on the rocks, led me downward. Bess, smelling the water, found a new reserve of energy. I let her lead the way down a treacherous, crumbling path. At the bottom of the gorge, a small, clear pool had collected, shaded by an ancient, gnarled cottonwood. It was an oasis in this land of fire and stone. I slid from Bess's back, my legs buckling, and crawled to the water's edge. I plunged my face into its blessed coolness, drinking until my stomach ached. It was then that I saw him. He was propped against the far wall of the gorge, in the deep shadow of an overhang. He was so still I had mistaken him for part of the rock. He wasn't the monster of my nightmares. He was a man, gaunt and drawn. His dark hair was matted with sweat and dirt. His buckskin leggings were torn, and one leg was stretched out before him at an unnatural angle, crudely splinted with branches and leather thongs. A dark, ugly stain of dried blood covered his thigh. His face was a mask of pain. His lips were cracked and pale. But his eyes were alive. They were dark and piercing, and they watched my every move with an unnerving intensity. A mix of weariness and defiance. He held a knife in his hand, but his grip was weak. He was dying. All the fear I had carried with me crystallized into a single sharp point. This was him, the savage, the reason for my exile. I froze, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't move, didn't speak. The silence stretched, broken only by Bess drinking greedily from the pool. He was my executioner, my captor, the punchline to the town's joke. But as I looked at him, huddled in the dirt, his body racked with fever and pain, I saw something else. I saw a human being in his last extremity. I saw a suffering that mirrored my own. We were two different kinds of castaways, left to perish in the same forsaken place. The men of Redemption Gulch had sent me here to die. They expected me to scream, to run. They expected weakness. And as I stood there trembling, a strange and unexpected feeling began to bloom in my chest. Defiance. My life was supposed to be over. My story had been written by Cain and Samuel. But here, in this gorge, with this dying man, there was no one to write the next page but me. My compassion, an emotion I thought had withered away from years of scorn, stirred within me. It was a foolish, dangerous feeling. Helping him could get me killed. Leaving him to die was the sensible thing to do. It was what was expected. I took a slow, deliberate step towards him. His eyes narrowed. His knuckles whitened on the hilt of his knife. I stopped. I slowly unslung the water skin from my shoulder. It was still half full. Holding it out, I took another step, my movements slow and unthreatening. I wasn't a peace offering from Redemption Gulch. I wasn't a bride. I was just a woman, offering water to a man who was dying of thirst. I stopped a few feet from him and set the water skin on the ground between us. Then I backed away, retreating to the other side of the small pool. I sat on a rock, my back to the cottonwood tree, and I watched him. For a long time, he did nothing. He just watched me, his gaze unwavering, trying to read my intentions. The sun dipped below the canyon rim, plunging us into a cool purple twilight. Finally, with a pained grunt, he reached out a trembling hand and dragged the water skin towards him. He fumbled with the stopper, his fingers weak before managing to pull it free. He drank slowly at first, then more deeply, the water spilling down his chin onto his chest. When he was done, he let his head fall back against the rock, his eyes closing for a moment. In that small act, a silent and profound transaction had occurred. I had not been given. I had chosen to give. He had not taken. He had accepted. The joke had been refused. In the profound silence of Painted Rock Gorge, surrounded by the ghosts and spirits of this ancient land, a new and uncertain story had just begun. The days that followed unfolded in a rhythm of silent observation. We were two islands in a small sea of sand and rock, separated by a gulf of language, culture, and fear. I named him Kale in my mind, a placeholder for the man whose true name I couldn't ask. His fever raged. During the day he would lie still, his breathing shallow, his face slick with sweat. At night a deep chill would set in, and he would tremble violently, his teeth chattering in the cold canyon air. I gathered wood for a small, cautious fire that I kept between us, a barrier as much as a source of warmth. For the first few days, I tended to my own survival. I refilled the water skin, rationed the last of my dried beef, and foraged for anything edible, though my knowledge was dangerously scant. I watched him constantly, my fear warring with a growing sense of responsibility. I had made a choice by offering him water, and that choice had tethered me to him. His leg was the source of the fever. The wound on his thigh was deep, the flesh around it swollen and an angry purplish red. It was clear that without intervention, the poison in his leg would kill him. I had no medical training, only the common knowledge of a frontier woman. I knew wounds needed cleaning. I knew fevers needed to be broken. The thought of touching him, of inflicting more pain, terrified me. But the thought of watching him die a slow, agonizing death was worse. On the fourth day, I made my decision. I boiled water from the pool in my small tin cup over the fire. I tore a strip from my petticoat, the last vestige of my former life, and soaked it in the hot water. He was awake, his dark eyes following my every move. As I approached, he tried to push himself up, his hand instinctively going to his knife. I stopped, holding up the steaming cloth in the cup. "I want to help," I said, my voice hoarse from disuse. The English words were meaningless to him, but I hoped the tone would convey my intent. He stared at me, his gaze searching my face. He was assessing me, weighing the risk. He was weak, vulnerable. I could easily kill him. He had every reason to distrust me. I took another slow step, then knelt beside him. I deliberately placed my own small knife on the ground, well out of my reach. It was an act of trust, a gesture of disarmament. I was making myself as vulnerable as he was. His eyes flickered from my face to my knife and back again. A long, tense moment passed. Then with a slow, deliberate exhalation, he relaxed his grip on his own weapon and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Permission. My hands trembled as I reached for his leg. The heat radiating from the wound was intense. I gently, carefully untied the leather thongs holding the crude splint. As I removed it, he let out a sharp hiss of pain, his body going rigid. But he did not cry out. The injury was worse than I had imagined. The bone was clearly shattered. The gash was deep and filled with dirt and pine needles. For the next hour I worked. I cleaned the wound as best I could with the hot water and cloth, my stomach churning at the sight and smell. He remained silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes squeezed shut. Sweat beaded on his forehead. I could feel the tremors of pain that racked his body, but he bore it with a stoicism that was both terrifying and admirable. When I was done, I knew I needed to do more. I remembered my grandmother, a woman of the old country, who used poultices of yarrow and plantain for wounds. I searched the sparse vegetation, my memory straining. I found a plant with feathery leaves that looked like yarrow, and another with broad, ribbed leaves I prayed was plantain. I chewed the leaves into a crude paste and applied it to the cleaned wound, binding it with more strips from my petticoat. I then found two straight, sturdy branches from the cottonwood, and using the leather thongs, resplinted his leg, making sure it was as straight and immobile as I could manage. The work left me exhausted and emotionally drained. I had crossed a threshold. I had touched him, tended his wounds, and bound myself to his fate. Over the next few days, a routine formed. I would change his dressing, forage for food, maintain the fire. He remained weak, but the fever began to recede. The angry redness around his wound lessened. My crude medicine was working. We began to communicate without words. A nod from him meant thanks. A gesture from me toward the sky, then a hand shading my eyes meant the sun was hot. He taught me through signs which berries were safe to eat and which roots to dig for. He pointed out the tracks of a rabbit near the waterhole and showed me how to fashion a simple snare. When I caught one, a small, scrawny thing, he showed me how to skin and cook it, nodding in approval as we shared the first real meat either of us had eaten in days. I learned to read the lines of pain around his eyes, to know when he needed to be moved, to understand his silent gratitude. He, in turn, seemed to learn the cadence of my own moods, my moments of despair, my flickers of hope. We were both marked by scars. His were physical, the gash on his leg, a long, faded scar that cut across his left cheekbone. My scars were invisible, etched on my soul by years of shame and sorrow. In that canyon, our shared brokenness became a form of understanding. We were no longer just a white woman and a native man. We were Serafina and Kale, two survivors sharing a small patch of ground against a hostile world. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, he spoke. I was adding a piece of wood to the fire when his voice, low and raspy, cut through the silence. Why? The word was English, spoken with a heavy accent, but perfectly clear. I looked up, startled. He was watching me, his expression intense. Why? He repeated, gesturing with his chin toward his bandaged leg. Your people, they did this. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain the cruelty of my town, the twisted logic of their joke? How could I explain that I was as much their victim as he was? They sent me here, I said finally, my voice quiet. They do not value me. He considered this for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to see right through me, to the bruised and barren places inside. He looked at my worn dress, my calloused hands, the deep weariness in my posture. He nodded slowly. I see, he said, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that he did. He understood what it was to be judged worthless, to be cast out. That single word and his quiet understanding forged a bond between us stronger than any shared language. We were no longer just sharing a fire. We were sharing the weight of our histories. The language of scars was a dialect we both spoke fluently. In the heart of that lonely gorge, I had found not a savage, but the first person who had ever truly seen me. The season began to turn. The brutal heat of high summer softened into the crisp, golden light of early autumn. Kale's leg was healing. The deep gash was knitting itself into a new scar. He was able to sit up for longer periods, and with the help of a sturdy crutch I fashioned for him, he could even stand for a few moments at a time. His strength returned in small increments. He began to take over tasks, showing me how to chip flint to create a sharper edge on my knife, how to read the clouds for signs of rain. His hands, though still thin, were deft and sure. There was an economy to his every movement, a deep and ingrained knowledge of the world around us. I was the student now, and he the patient teacher. Our conversations were sparse, but we filled the gaps with gestures and a growing instinctual understanding. He told me through a combination of words and drawings in the sand that his people were gone. He drew figures of men on horses, of fire and smoke. He drew a line through them all, a stark and brutal finality. He was the only one left, a man without a tribe. I, in turn, told him about Samuel, about the debt, about the town's cruel mockery of my barrenness. I spoke the word barren aloud to him, and though he did not understand its meaning, he understood the pain with which I said it. He did not offer pity. He offered something far more valuable, his quiet, validating presence. Life in the gorge settled into a peaceful, if precarious, routine. The constant, gnawing fear that had defined my first days had been replaced by a quiet competence. I knew how to find water, how to trap small game, how to make a shelter. I was leaner, harder. The soft, useless woman who had ridden out of Redemption Gulch was gone. I had been scoured down to my essential self, and I found that I was not as fragile as I had been led to believe. One morning, a strange sound carried on the wind, a faint rhythmic creaking. Cale heard it first. He stiffened, his head tilted, scanning the rim of the canyon above us. I listened, and I heard it too. Wagon wheels. A wagon meant people. It meant the world outside our sanctuary was intruding. A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. Cale grabbed his knife, his body tensing for a fight. He gestured for me to get back into the shadows of the rock overhang. We waited, hidden, as the sound grew louder. It was coming from the west, following an old faint trail that ran along the top of the gorge. Then we heard a different sound, shouts, a gunshot, sharp and violent, that echoed through the canyon. Another followed, then a splintering crash, and then a terrible, chilling silence. We stayed hidden for what felt like hours. Not another sound came from above. Cale, his face grim, decided we had to investigate. The possibility of hostiles was a grave danger, but the possibility of supplies, food, tools, perhaps even a firearm, was too great to ignore. He moved with surprising speed despite his injury, using the crutch with practiced skill. I followed close behind, my heart pounding. The climb out of the gorge was arduous. When we finally pulled ourselves over the rim, the sight that met our eyes made me gasp and cover my mouth. It was a small homesteader's wagon. One of the wheels was shattered, causing it to list sideways like a foundering ship. Two mules lay dead in their traces. The bodies of a man and a woman were sprawled in the dust nearby. They had been shot. Arrows bristled from the man's chest. The scene was one of brutal, shocking violence. The wagon had been ransacked, its contents strewn across the ground. Sacks of flour torn open, clothes scattered, a broken mirror glinting in the sun. Cale surveyed the scene, his eyes missing nothing. He knelt and examined the tracks, the arrows. "Not my people," he said, his voice a low growl. "Raiders, outcasts." A profound sadness washed over me. This poor family, like Samuel and me, had come west with dreams, only to have them extinguished in a flash of pointless violence. It was a stark reminder of how fragile life was out here. As Cale searched for anything salvageable, I heard a sound. It was faint, a tiny mewling cry, almost lost beneath the whisper of the wind. I froze. "Cale, did you hear that?" He looked up, listening. The cry came again, thin and weak, from the back of the wrecked wagon. I scrambled over the scattered belongings, my hands trembling as I pulled back a heavy canvas tarp. And there, nestled in a small wooden crate padded with blankets, was a baby. It couldn't have been more than a few months old, its face red and blotchy from crying, its tiny fists clenched. It was wrapped in a clean linen cloth, miraculously untouched by the surrounding chaos. I stared, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. A baby, a living, breathing child in the midst of all this death. Without thinking, I reached down and lifted the infant into my arms. It was so light, so fragile. As I held it close, its cries quieted, replaced by small, hiccuping sobs. It snuggled against my chest, seeking warmth and comfort. A feeling I had long since buried, a deep and primal ache, surged through me with the force of a physical blow. It was the ghost of 1,000 prayers, the echo of 1,000,000 teardrops shed in the dark. My arms, which had always felt so empty, were suddenly miraculously full. Tears streamed down my face, not of sorrow for the dead, but of an overwhelming, unnameable emotion for the living child in my arms. Cale came to stand beside me, looking down at the baby. His face, usually a stoic mask, softened with a profound sadness. He looked from the child to the bodies of its parents, and then to me. He saw the look on my face, the fierce, protective way I was holding the infant. "We cannot leave it," I whispered, my voice thick with tears. He nodded slowly. "No, we cannot." We buried the parents, a grim and silent task. We wrapped them in their own blankets and laid them to rest under a pile of stones, marking their graves with a crude cross made from two pieces of a broken wagon board. It was all we could do. We salvaged what we could: a barrel of water, a sack of cornmeal, an axe, and most importantly, the small wooden crate with the baby's few belongings: some cloth diapers, a small tin of milk powder, and a silver locket. I opened the locket. Inside was a tiny, expertly painted portrait of the woman. On the other side, a single name was engraved: Rowan. We took the child, whom I now thought of as Rowan, back down into the sanctuary of the gorge. That night, as I sat by the fire feeding the baby, a thin gruel of cornmeal and water from my fingertips, something shifted inside me. The barren woman was gone. The joke was over. I was no longer defined by my emptiness. I was defined by the small, warm weight in my arms, by the tiny mouth that searched for sustenance, by the absolute, fierce certainty that I would protect this child with my life. Cale watched us from across the fire. He saw the transformation, the purpose that now radiated from me. He had seen me at my lowest, a discarded, frightened creature. Now he saw a mother. I had been sent into the wilderness as a punishment for being unable to bear a child. And now the wilderness had given me one. Not from my body, but for my soul. Bartholomew Kane and the men of Redemption Gulch had written me out of their story. They had no idea I was just beginning to write my own. The arrival of Rowan changed everything. The silent canyon, once a place of mere survival, became a home. Our days were now dictated by the baby's needs. My hands, once raw from foraging, learned a new gentleness as I bathed him in the pool and rocked him to sleep under the vast, starry sky. The ache in my heart, the hollow space that had defined me, was filled with a fierce and boundless love. He was not of my blood, but he was of my heart. Every time he grasped my finger with his tiny hand, he healed a part of me I thought was irreparably broken. Cale, too, was transformed. The grim survivor, the last of his tribe, revealed a tenderness I would never have expected. He would sit for hours carving small, smooth wooden toys for Rowan: a bird, a horse, a perfectly round ball. He would watch me sing the old lullabies my mother had once sung to me, his expression soft. Sometimes when Rowan fussed, Cale would take him and murmur in his own language, a low melodic sound that seemed to calm the baby instantly. We were a strange and unlikely family, forged in tragedy and bound by the needs of an innocent child. But we knew our time in the gorge was limited. The salvaged cornmeal wouldn't last forever, and the coming winter would bring snow to the high country. We needed supplies. We needed a plan. The thought of returning to Redemption Gulch filled me with a cold dread. But what other choice was there? It was the only outpost for 100 miles. We needed salt, flour, and warmer blankets for Rowan. "I will go," I told Cale one evening as Rowan slept soundly in his crate cradle. Cale looked up from the arrow he was fletching. "No, it is not safe for you." "It's not safe for you either," I countered. "They see you, they'll shoot first and ask questions, never. They see me, they'll be shocked, but they won't shoot, not in the middle of town." I took a deep breath. "I have to face them, Cale. For Rowan. I won't spend my life hiding in a canyon." He saw the resolve in my eyes and did not argue further. He simply nodded. "We will go together, to the edge of the town. I will wait." It was not a request, it was a statement. He would not let me go alone. What we didn't know was that word of my survival had already reached Redemption Gulch. A lone trapper passing through the high country had seen smoke rising from Painted Rock Gorge. Driven by curiosity, he had crept close enough to see a woman with sun-streaked hair and a native man living together. He had seen the baby. The news hit Redemption Gulch like a bolt of lightning. The trapper told his story in Kane's saloon, and the tale grew with every telling. The barren Mrs. Hayes wasn't dead. She was alive, living with the very savage she'd been sent to. And impossibly, she had a child. Samuel Hayes, who had spent the last few months in a guilt-ridden alcoholic haze, was sobered by the news. The thought that I was alive and with another man filled him with a toxic cocktail of shame, jealousy, and fear. Bartholomew Kane was furious. His perfect cruel joke had unraveled. The woman he had discarded was now the subject of legend. She had not been a victim. She had become a symbol of something wild and defiant that he could not control. His authority, built on fear, was subtly undermined. "She's been tainted," he declared in the saloon, his voice booming. "Living with that redskin, she's no better than he is. And that child, where did that come from? It's an abomination." The town was divided. Some, like Cain's cronies, saw me as a traitor to my race, a fallen woman. The pious wives whispered that the child was surely the devil's spawn. But there were others, the quiet ones, the people who had borne Cain's thumb on their necks for years. For them, my story was a flicker of hope. The woman they had pitied had become something to be reckoned with. We, of course, heard none of this. Our world was the canyon, the child, and the quiet bond between us. We prepared for our journey, unaware that the world was already preparing for us. We left the gorge at dawn. I carried Rowan strapped to my chest in a sling Cale had fashioned from a soft deerskin. He walked beside me, his limp barely noticeable now, carrying a bow and a quiver of arrows. Bess, the old mare, was loaded with our few possessions. We were a strange sight, a weathered woman in a tattered dress, a scarred warrior, and a baby, moving as a single, determined unit across the vast landscape. As we crested the last rise and saw the dusty sprawl of Redemption Gulch below, I took a deep breath. I had left this town as a victim. I was returning as a survivor and a mother. "I will wait in the rocks north of the creek," Cale said, his voice low. "If you are not back by sundown, I am coming." I nodded, my throat tight. "I'll be back." I handed him the small wooden bird he had carved for Rowan. "Keep this, to remember us if—" I couldn't finish. He took the bird, his fingers closing around it. "You will be back," he said, his certainty a shield. "You are not the woman they sent away." He was right. I wasn't. I adjusted Rowan in his sling, squared my shoulders, and started the long walk down into the hornet's nest. Walking into Redemption Gulch was like stepping back into a bad dream. The same dust, the same rickety buildings, the same scent of manure and despair. But I was different. The sun and wind had tanned my skin and stripped away my softness. My gaze was direct, my stride purposeful, and strapped to my chest was the undeniable, impossible proof of my new life. A child. The first person to see me was old Mrs. Gable, sweeping the porch of the dress shop. Her broom froze mid-sweep. Her jaw dropped. The clatter of her broom hitting the wood planks was the first sound to break the midday stupor. Heads began to turn. A blacksmith's hammer stopped mid-swing. Men loafing outside the saloon straightened up, their smirks fading into stunned confusion. Windows and doors opened. A wave of silence rolled down the street, a palpable, spreading shock. They stared at me, then at the baby nestled against my chest. The whispers started, a low hiss that followed me like a rattlesnake's warning. "It's her, Hayes's wife. Look, she has a baby." I ignored them all. My focus was the mercantile. I needed supplies, and I would not be deterred. I walked with my head held high, my hand resting protectively on Rowan's back. He slept peacefully, oblivious to the storm his presence was creating. As I reached the center of town, two figures emerged from the saloon, blocking my path. Bartholomew Kane and my husband Samuel. Kane's face was a thundercloud of fury. His polite mask had slipped, revealing the raw, ugly entitlement beneath. He had orchestrated my demise, and my very existence was an act of defiance. Samuel looked like a ghost. He was thinner, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. He stared at me, then at Rowan, a look of profound, agonizing conflict on his features. He saw the woman he had thrown away return from the dead, transformed into someone he no longer recognized. And he saw the child, the living symbol of everything he had failed to be. "Seraphina," he breathed, his voice a dry croak. I met his gaze, but I felt nothing. No love, no hate, only a distant, weary pity. Kane stepped forward. Well, well, he boomed, his voice dripping with venom. Look what the buzzards dragged in. We all thought you were dead, Mrs. Hayes. Your disappointment is noted, Mr. Kane, I replied, my voice steady and clear. It carried in the dead silence of the street. His eyes narrowed, flicking down to Rowan. And what is that? Some kind of souvenir you picked up from your savage lover? A collective gasp went through the crowd. The insult was crude, public, designed to shame me, but the shame would not stick. I had lived through too much to be wounded by his words. This, I said, my voice ringing with a strength I didn't know I possessed, is my son. His name is Rowan. Your son? Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Don't be ridiculous. Everyone knows you're as barren as this desert. You think you can walk back in here with some half-breed bastard and call it your own? Before I could respond, Samuel took a staggering step forward. Is it? Is it his? He asked, his eyes locked on Rowan, his voice trembling with a desperate, pathetic jealousy. The warriors! I finally looked at my husband, at the pathetic ruin he had become. His father and mother are dead, I said, my voice softening slightly for the child's sake. They were good people whose path crossed with men far more savage than any warrior I have met. My eyes flicked meaningfully to Kane. The implication hung in the air. Enough of this, Kane snarled, losing control. You have no place here, woman. You abandoned your husband, shacked up with an Indian. You are a disgrace. This town wants nothing to do with you or your foundling. I am not here for the town's approval, I stated calmly. I am here for supplies. I have pelts to trade. I gestured to the small bundle on Bess's back. And then I will be on my way. Your way to where? Kane sneered. Back to your mud hut in the canyons? That's no place to raise a child. A decent, God-fearing town is where he belongs. Perhaps with a proper family? The threat was unmistakable. He was implying he could take Rowan from me. A primal, cold fury unlike anything I had ever known rose up in me. I took a step back, my body instinctively shielding the baby. You will not touch him, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. It was not a plea, it was a promise. The crowd was mesmerized. This was not the timid, shamed Serafina Hayes they had known. This was a woman who had walked through fire and emerged forged into steel. Kane saw it too. He saw his usual tactics of shame and intimidation were useless. He was about to retort when the mercantile owner, a balding man named Abernathy, who had always been cowed by Kane, spoke up from his doorway. Let her trade, Bartholomew, he said, his voice quavering but firm. She's a customer. The pelts are good. Kane shot him a look of pure venom, but the spell of his authority had been momentarily broken. Other townspeople murmured in agreement. My defiance had given a sliver of courage to others. Thwarted, Kane fell silent, his face mottled with rage. He was a bully challenged in his own schoolyard. I turned my back on him and on Samuel and walked toward the mercantile. The crowd parted from me, their eyes full of a new and bewildering emotion. Respect. I had walked into the heart of their judgment and had not flinched. I had claimed my child, my life, and my dignity right in the dusty main street of the town that had tried to strip me of all three. The joke was well and truly over, and Bartholomew Kane was not laughing. Inside the mercantile, Samuel followed me, his pathetic pleas for a second chance falling on deaf ears. There is nothing for me here with you, I told him, the finality in my voice a wall between us. Our conversation was cut short as the doorway darkened. Bartholomew Kane and two of his hired thugs stood there, rifles ready, the town square scattered. Hand over the boy, Serafina, Kane snarled, his authority absolute again. We'll see he's raised proper, in an orphanage, away from your corrupting influence. The threat was clear. He would take Rowan, even if it meant killing me. Just as my hope waned, the town's silence shattered. Samuel, in a final desperate act of courage, or perhaps just guilt, let out a yell and lunged at one of the thugs, creating a chaotic distraction. I seized the moment, grabbing my sack of supplies and running for Bess. The other thug aimed his rifle at my back. A pistol shot cracked from the mercantile porch. Not at me, at the thug. Mr. Abernathy, the timid shopkeeper, stood there, a smoking pistol in his hand. He had chosen a side. Amid the chaos, Cain drew his own pistol, aiming it straight at my heart. But before he could fire, an arrow hissed out of the silence, embedding itself deep in the wooden post right beside his head. On the northern ridge, Kyle was visible, a silent guardian with another arrow already notched. The message was unmistakable. Cain's power, challenged by the guilty, the decent, and the defiant, was broken. He stood down, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. I galloped out of that town without a backward glance, reuniting with Cale at the creek. My redemption wasn't about being accepted by the world that had cast me out. It was about building my own. With my child safe in my arms and my true family by my side, we turned deeper into the wilderness to forge a new life. A life where worth was measured not by blood, but by love and courage. The wild had not broken me. It had made me whole. The story of Serafina, Cal, and the child born not of blood, but of bravery is a testament to the power of the human spirit to create a family in the most desolate of places. It's a reminder that true savagery often wears a civilized mask, and that redemption isn't found in a town's forgiveness, but in one's own courage to walk away and forge a new path. They were three castaways who found a home in each other, proving that a family is not what you are born into, but what you are willing to fight for. If this story of survival, prejudice, and the creation of an unlikely family moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a story where the underdog doesn't just survive, but triumphs on their own terms. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. Your support allows us to keep telling these stories. Thank you for listening.